You gave her what? I stood in my mother's living room, the morning light cutting across the floral carpet I grew up playing on. My voice didn't sound like mine. Mom's hand fluttered dismissively as if my question was an annoyance. Relax, Emily. Sophie needed something nice to wear for her engagement party. It's not a big deal. I looked over her shoulder, through the half-open bedroom door. The antique mahogany jewelry box, the one Grandma Rose left me, sat open and empty on the dresser. My heart thudded, so hard I thought it would crack a rib. Sophie's laugh drifted from the kitchen, light and careless. In that moment, something in me went perfectly still. I knew I would never trust either of them again. My name is Emily Carter, and I used to think loyalty was enough. I was 29 when it happened, the jewelry incident, but it was just the final straw in a story that had been writing itself since I was a child. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a two-story colonial house shaded by moss-draped oaks. People always said our family looked perfect from the outside. My father, a retired Navy officer turned small-town postmaster. My mother, a Southern homemaker with perfect nails and prettier lies. And me, their only daughter. Or so it seemed. But the truth is, in my mother's eyes, I never truly belonged. Not the way Sophie did. Sophie was my cousin. Technically my mom's niece, the daughter of her wild younger sister who passed away when we were both in middle school. Sophie came to live with us soon after, and from that moment on, everything changed. My bedroom closet started to feel smaller. My birthday parties became shared. And my mother's praise, once rare and treasured, now flowed in Sophie's direction like a waterfall. You could learn a thing or two from Sophie. She knows how to behave. Look how nicely Sophie sets the table. You're always rushing. Maybe Sophie should wear that dress, Emily. It suits her complexion better. Back then, I didn't have the words for what I felt. I thought maybe if I worked harder, she'd see me again. Maybe if I got straight A's, she'd notice. I did. She didn't. She clapped the loudest at Sophie's dance recitals but skipped my debate finals because she didn't want to sit through all that talking. By the time we were in high school, Sophie had fully taken over the role of Golden Girl. I became the one who blended into the background. I focused on school, on saving every dollar I could from tutoring gigs and part-time work at the library. But even then, the few things that brought me joy were picked at and minimized. Except for one thing, Grandma Rose. My father's mother was a quiet woman with kind eyes and soft, weathered hands that always smelled like lavender and books. She lived a few hours away in a smaller, more peaceful town called Beaufort, and I visited her every summer growing up. With her, I was always enough. She didn't try to change me. She'd just sit with me on the porch swing, her knitting needles clicking while I scribbled stories in my notebook. One summer when I was 16, Grandma Rose pulled me into her bedroom. She opened a velvet-lined chest at the foot of her bed and showed me her jewelry collection. It wasn't flashy or particularly expensive, but it was rich in history. Lockets with tiny sepia photos, cameos from her own mother, a pearl bracelet she wore on her wedding day. "One day, this will be yours, Em," she said, placing a delicate garnet ring in my palm. Not because of tradition, but because you see people. You carry stories. And I want someone who will remember them. That moment carved itself into my bones. It was the first time I truly felt chosen. When she passed 5 years later, the jewelry box was delivered to me, just like she promised. My mother rolled her eyes and said, "Well, Rose always did have a soft spot for the quiet ones." But I didn't care. That box became sacred. I rarely wore the pieces, but I polished them, cataloged them, and knew every story behind each clasp and chain. They weren't just ornaments. They were memories. They were mine. After college, I moved to New York for grad school. I earned my MBA and started working as a brand consultant for ethical fashion startups. It wasn't flashy, but it was meaningful work, and I'd quietly done well for myself. I traveled a lot and didn't visit home often, especially as the tension with my mother and Sophie simmered in the background. Sophie, on the other hand, had bloomed into the small-town princess. She started a lifestyle blog, married a minor league baseball player named Josh, and curated her social media feed like her life depended on it. But beneath the surface, she was always borrowing money, clothes, time, praise. And my mother was always the one enabling it. So when I came home that weekend for Dad's birthday, I wasn't expecting warmth, but I wasn't expecting war either. And yet, there I stood, watching Sophie strut into the kitchen in my grandmother's garnet ring, wearing my mother's smug approval like perfume. I didn't explode. I didn't even argue. I went upstairs and opened the jewelry box to confirm it. Empty. Not misplaced. Not borrowed.
Gone.
When I asked my mother, she gave me a tired smile and said, "It's just jewelry, Emily. You barely wore it. Sophie needed something special. She's getting engaged. Don't be selfish."
Selfish.
That word echoed inside me like a slap. After all the years of quiet, obedient effort, that was her verdict. Not even a call. Not even a text. She had opened the box, taken what wasn't hers, and handed it to someone else, as if I didn't exist. I stayed in my childhood bedroom that night, not sleeping, just staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, dusty circles. I thought about Grandma Rose. I thought about that porch swing and her gentle hands. I thought about how she had trusted me to guard something precious. And then I thought about every time I had been made to shrink so Sophie could shine. That was the night I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for a place at a table that was never set for me. I was going to build my own table and buy the damn tablecloth too. Over the next few months, I did exactly that. It started small. I pulled together the business plan I'd been sitting on for years. A high-end jewelry curation company focused on legacy, memory, and storytelling. Inspired by Grandma Rose's values, I called it inheritance. I poured in my savings, leaned on industry contacts I'd made from consulting, and found a vintage dealer in LA who helped me source rare heirloom pieces. I trained under a retired metalsmith in Brooklyn for design theory and restoration. At first, I just wanted to reclaim what had been stolen from me metaphorically. But then something happened. People resonated. Women reached out with stories of lost family pieces, broken heirlooms, symbolic trinkets. I listened. I repaired. I restored. I wasn't just selling jewelry. I was reviving legacies. And the business boomed. 6 months after that awful weekend, I received an email from a Southern estate manager. An anonymous collection of vintage jewelry was being sold from an old Charleston estate. Everything from early 20th century pendants to custom 1950s engagement sets. My heart skipped. I knew the house. It was the Hamilton estate. My mom had always admired it, had even hinted they were connected distantly through marriage. She always wanted to be associated with it. And now, its contents were up for sale. I flew down 2 weeks later and won the lot at auction, under my business name, not my own. It was only when I opened the boxes in my Manhattan loft that I saw it. Nestled inside a velvet case, almost overlooked among dozens of others, was a pearl brooch with my great-aunt's initials engraved behind it. One my mom had mentioned obsessively years ago. If I ever owned one thing from the Hamiltons, that would be it. Well, now I did. And it was about to become the centerpiece of my newest campaign. 6 weeks later, I returned to Charleston. It was late afternoon when I pulled into my parents' driveway. The camellia bushes were overgrown. The porch paint had started to peel. It struck me as poetic, how the house had begun to look as tired and brittle as the relationships inside it. I didn't call ahead. I just walked in, the same way I had countless times before, and set the slim leather folder on the sideboard in the entryway. From the kitchen, I could hear my mother's voice, sharp, commanding, the way it always got when she was hosting. She must have been having Sophie over again. Part of me wondered if she had any idea that everything she valued most, her social standing, her carefully constructed narrative, was about to be dismantled by the daughter she never quite believed in. I took a breath. I wasn't here to gloat. But I wasn't here to stay silent either. "Emily," my mother called, her voice floating through the hallway with a note of reluctant surprise. "Is that you?" I stepped into the doorway. Sophie sat at the table, absently scrolling on her phone. The garnet ring glinted on her finger. Seeing it there still made my chest tighten, but the hurt was dull now, replaced by something cleaner. Resolve. I smiled, just enough to be polite. Hi, Mom. Sophie. My mother gave me that brittle look she always did, the one that said she was assessing whether my presence was an inconvenience or an opportunity. We didn't know you were coming. I didn't plan to, I said. I kept my voice calm, even professional. I'm only in town for a couple of days. There's something I needed to bring by. Sophie looked up, frowning faintly. Oh, what's that? I reached behind me, retrieved the leather folder, and laid it gently on the kitchen table. My mother's gaze flicked to it with mild suspicion. What is this? I sat across from her and folded my hands. A business matter. Sophie rolled her eyes, like she always did when I talked about my career. To her, work was a hobby for women who couldn't find someone to marry them. But my mother leaned forward, curiosity finally outweighing condescension. She flipped the folder open and scanned the first page. Her lips moved as she read the letterhead. Inheritance, fine jewelry, and legacy preservation. I let the silence stretch, watched the comprehension dawn, molecule by molecule. She flipped to the invoice summary. I could see the exact moment she recognized the estate name at the top of the page. Hamilton Family Collection. Her face went pale. I'm sure you remember, I said gently, how much you used to admire that brooch. Sophie frowned. What brooch? The Hamilton pearl brooch, my mother whispered, her voice almost strangled. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face like she was hoping this was some elaborate prank. You bought the collection? I nodded. All of it. There was a beat of stunned silence. Outside, a mockingbird trilled in the old oak tree. Inside, the kitchen seemed to shrink around us. But how? My mother's voice was small. I had never heard her sound so unsteady. I built something, I said simply. And when the auction was announced, I placed the winning bid. Sophie finally set her phone down. You bought jewelry just to what? Rub it in her face? She laughed, a brittle, high sound. That's pathetic. I tilted my head, studying her the way I might study a piece of damaged metal I planned to melt down. No, Sophie. I bought it because it belonged in the hands of someone who respects history and legacy, not someone who would give it away because she didn't think it mattered. My mother's jaw tightened. Emily, this is childish. I let out a slow breath, steadying my hands.
No.
What was childish was believing that if I shrank myself small enough, you'd finally see me. She tried to speak, but I held up a hand. For the first time in my life, I watched her fall silent at my signal. That alone felt like a revolution. I opened the folder wider, revealing the legal transfer documents. The Hamilton pieces will be featured in Inheritance's new heritage collection next quarter. They'll be preserved, documented, and shared with the public. That's what they deserve. Sophie sputtered. This is insane. They were supposed to be part of our... Your what? My voice was soft but unyielding. Your image? Your curated little story about belonging to a family you barely knew? You already have my grandmother's ring. You don't get this too. Her cheeks flushed bright red. I earned it, Aunt Carol always said. I turned to my mother, meeting her gaze fully for the first time. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That you could just take what wasn't yours to give, and I'd roll over like I always did? Her throat bobbed. For once, she didn't have an answer. I reached into my purse and withdrew a smaller, velvet-lined box. Slowly, I opened it to reveal the brooch, the lustrous pearls framed in filigree gold. My mother's eyes went glassy. She lifted her hand as if to touch it, but stopped short, realizing she no longer had any claim. This, I said quietly, was never yours to dream about. And it's not mine to hoard either. It's going to be displayed in our first flagship gallery. It'll have your grandmother's name on the placard. I thought you should know. Her voice cracked. Emily, please. Please what? I whispered. Pretend you didn't spend my entire life telling me I was less? That I should be grateful for scraps? You crossed a line, Mom. And I'm not here to play small anymore. Sophie pushed her chair back, muttering something under her breath as she fled the room. My mother stayed frozen, her eyes fixed on the brooch like it might disappear. I stood and gently closed the box, sliding it back into my bag. I have a flight to catch. I just wanted you to understand how things are going to be from now on. My mother swallowed hard. And how is that exactly? I met her gaze evenly. You don't get to define my worth. Not anymore. She looked as though she might break. But I felt no triumph in it. Only relief. I turned to go, pausing in the doorway. One more thing, I said softly. Inheritance isn't just my business. It's my purpose. And it's thriving. For a moment, I imagined Grandma Rose standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder, telling me she was proud. I walked out to the car, the late afternoon light painting the yard in gold. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. And for the first time in my life, I knew I didn't owe them anything. I didn't expect to hear from them again so soon. But less than 48 hours after I flew back to New York, my phone started ringing. The first call I ignored. The second. The third. By the fifth, I picked up. Emily. My mother's voice rushed out the moment the line connected. She sounded breathless, almost frantic. We need to talk. I'm working. This can't wait. I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. Mom, if this is about the Hamilton collection, it's about your grandmother's ring. I opened my eyes. The office around me, sunlight filtering across mood boards, a shipping clerk tapping out invoices, suddenly felt like another universe compared to the chaos she was determined to drag me back into. What about it? Her voice was strained. Sophie lost it. I let out a laugh, short, incredulous. She what? She took it off at the salon. She thinks she left it on the counter. Emily, it's gone. I waited for the guilt, the heartbreak. But instead, I felt something unexpected. A clean detachment. Like a rope I'd been tethered to all my life had finally snapped, and I was free to drift away. I'm sorry to hear that, I said coolly. You have to understand, she's been under a lot of stress with the wedding. Mom. I rubbed my forehead. I don't have to understand anything. She fell silent. For once, she didn't argue. Look, she said eventually, her voice turning brittle. Maybe you could help her replace it. You have resources now. Are you asking me to spend my money replacing something that was stolen from me in the first place? It wasn't stolen, she snapped, her composure cracking. It was a gift. It wasn't your gift to give. My voice didn't rise, but it carried enough weight that she stopped talking. I let the silence settle before I continued. I hope you find the ring. I really do. But this isn't my problem anymore. And then I hung up. I'd never hung up on her before. The realization made something sharp and bright bloom in my chest. The next call was from Sophie. She didn't bother with pleasantries. I don't know what you think you're doing, she hissed the moment I answered. But you're not going to make me look like a fool in front of this town. I'm not doing anything, I said, almost amused. You're managing that all by yourself. Don't you dare talk to me like that, she seethed. You think buying that jewelry makes you better than me? No, I said calmly. But watching you lose what you took does. There was a sharp inhale, the sound of her trying to find a retort she didn't have. I'm warning you, Emily, she said finally. This little power trip, it won't last. I smiled. We'll see. I ended the call and let my phone drop onto my desk. For the first time, I realized how little power they had over me. Their approval, their disapproval, it was all noise. And I was finally learning how to turn down the volume. Still, I knew this wouldn't be the end. I knew my mother wasn't going to let go of her carefully constructed narrative so easily. I was right. A week later, I got an invitation in the mail. Heavy ivory cardstock, embossed lettering. You are cordially invited to the engagement party of Sophie Elaine Harper and Joshua Robert Klein. At the bottom, in smaller script, was a note. We hope you'll bring the Hamilton brooch to wear.
It would mean so much to the family.
I read it twice, the audacity almost making me laugh out loud. The brooch they had never owned, the collection they had mocked me for buying, now it was a prop for their performance. But I wasn't surprised. Not really. I tucked the invitation into a drawer and went back to work. The day of the engagement party, I didn't plan to attend. But around noon, I found myself driving south on the interstate anyway, the brooch secured in a small velvet case beside me. Not because I wanted to display it for them, but because I was done hiding. When I walked into the venue, a manicured event space on the Ashley River, heads turned. I had dressed deliberately. A sleek navy dress, my hair pinned in an elegant twist, the brooch fastened neatly above my heart. Sophie's face blanched when she saw me. My mother, hovering beside her, took a single step forward, her smile brittle. "Emily," she began, her voice falsely bright. "You made it." I nodded politely. "I did." "And the brooch." She gestured weakly, as if it might leap into her hand of its own accord. "It looks beautiful." "It does." Sophie recovered first. She slipped her arm through Josh's and lifted her chin. "We'd love to have it displayed with the cake, so everyone can see the family legacy." I tilted my head, studying her. "The family legacy?" Her smile flickered. "Well, yes." I took a step closer. The hush that spread through the guests was almost tangible. "Funny," I said softly, "how you only remember I'm family when you need something." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I shifted my gaze to my mother. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because Grandma Rose taught me that you don't have to erase history to create something new." I unpinned the brooch and held it in my palm. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This belonged to her," I said clearly. "It's part of her story and mine. But it's not a prop." I turned, found the event coordinator, a woman named Laura I'd met briefly when I arrived. I extended the brooch to her. "Would you please keep this somewhere secure until I'm ready to leave?" She nodded, her eyes wide with something like respect. "Of course." I turned back to my mother and Sophie. "Enjoy your party," I said evenly. "But leave me out of your displays." I walked away before they could respond, my pulse steady. All around me, conversations resumed, but I knew people were watching. I didn't care. For once, I was proud to be seen exactly as I was. Later, I stood outside on the balcony, overlooking the water. A warm breeze lifted the hair from my neck, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. I closed my eyes and breathed in the freedom. "You are always braver than you thought," a voice said softly behind me. I turned to see Lydia, my mother's oldest friend. She was holding a glass of iced tea, her eyes kind. "I remember when you were little," she went on. "You'd sit on the porch with Rose, listening to her stories. You were always paying attention, even when the rest of them weren't." I felt a lump rise in my throat. She was the only one who made me feel like I mattered. "She knew you did," Lydia said. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "And so do I." I swallowed hard. "Thank you." She smiled. "Don't let them steal that from you again." "I won't," I promised. And I meant it. When I returned to the main hall, Sophie was in the corner, surrounded by a cluster of friends. She glanced up as I passed, her expression pinched and sour. I didn't stop. I didn't engage.
I didn't need to.
At the end of the night, I retrieved the brooch, thanked the staff, and walked out without saying another word to my mother. On the drive back to New York, I felt something loosen in me. A knot I hadn't known I was carrying finally came undone. I realized that I'd spent so much of my life trying to earn love that was conditional, performative, transactional. Now I was finally free to love myself without their permission. I was free to build a life that didn't revolve around their approval. And that, I thought as I crossed the state line, was worth more than any piece of jewelry. It had been 3 months since Sophie's engagement party. 3 months since I walked out of that hall with the brooch pinned safely to my jacket and a clear, unwavering sense that I was finally done trying to belong where I was never valued. Back in New York, my days took on a gentle, nourishing rhythm. My mornings began early, usually before sunrise, with strong coffee and a notebook filled with ideas. Inheritance was growing faster than I could have predicted. What had started as a one-woman venture was becoming a movement. We had hired 3 additional artisans, women who, like me, had inherited more disappointment than wealth. There was Jasmine, a metalsmith who used to restore antique watches in her grandfather's Harlem shop. Amaya, a gemologist who had fled a controlling marriage to start over in the city. Lydia, a recent college grad who'd been the first in her family to earn a degree in design. Together, we sat at long work tables, our hands busy with tiny pliers and magnifiers, our conversations weaving in and out of stories about where we'd come from, about what we wanted to build. Some days, when the winter wind rattled the windows, I would think of Grandma Rose. I could almost see her sitting at the corner of the studio, her patient smile telling me that I had finally become who I was always meant to be. I kept my family at a distance. My mother called occasionally, mostly to deliver stilted updates about Sophie's wedding plans, or to hint that maybe I should be more supportive. But I had learned the power of letting her calls go to voicemail. I wasn't cruel about it. I was simply done. One afternoon, I received a letter, an honest-to-God letter, written on thick cream stationery with a shaky hand. It was from my father. Dear Emily, I know things between you and your mother have never been simple. I'm not proud of how often I stood back instead of standing up for you. I see that now. I hope someday you'll be willing to sit down with me, just the two of us. No expectations, no defenses. Just a conversation. I miss you. Love, Dad. I read it 3 times, my chest tightening. He had never been cruel the way my mother was, but he had been absent in the moments that mattered most. Still, there was something honest in the letter I hadn't seen in a long time. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my journal. I wasn't ready to call him back yet, but I wasn't ready to close the door completely either. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a symposium on heritage design in Manhattan. The event was hosted in a grand old library, the kind with carved mahogany panels and chandeliers dripping with crystal. As I stepped up to the podium, I felt a familiar flutter in my stomach. I thought about how not so long ago, I would have been terrified to take up this much space, to say out loud that I had something worth sharing. But when I looked out over the rows of attentive faces, something in me steadied. I was taught that the things we inherit define us. I began. But I've learned that it's what we do with those things, the memories, the wounds, the legacies, that truly tells the story of who we are. I saw heads nodding, eyes bright with understanding. I created inheritance because I wanted to prove something to myself. I continued. But what I've discovered is that reclaiming your story isn't just an act of defiance. It's an act of love for the generations that came before and for the self you're becoming. When the applause filled the hall, it wasn't just validation. It was a kind of absolution. That evening, as I was locking up the studio, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Sophie.
Can we talk?
I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to ignore her. Part of me wanted to send something scathing and final. Instead, I typed, "What about?" Her response came almost immediately.
I'm sorry.
Just those 2 words. Nothing else. I exhaled, surprised at the strange ache in my chest. It would have been easier if she'd stayed defensive, easier to keep her in the box labeled enemy. But life wasn't that simple. After a long moment, I wrote back, "I'm not ready to forgive you, but I'm willing to hear you out. Tomorrow?" She replied, "Tomorrow." The next afternoon, we met at a small cafe near Washington Square. I chose it because it was neutral ground, neither of our turf. Sophie was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug. For the first time, she looked small, not polished or confident, but tired. "Hi," she said when I sat down. "Hi." There was an awkward pause. Then she took a breath. "I don't know where to start." I waited. She swallowed. "I've been thinking about that day. The engagement party. You were right. I took things that weren't mine. Not just the jewelry, everything. The praise. The attention. Even the space in this family that should have belonged to you." My throat tightened. "You deserved better," she whispered. "And I'm sorry I was too selfish to see that." I didn't say anything. I just watched her, trying to measure how much of this was real. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I didn't want to get married without telling you that. I studied her face, searching for the manipulative glint I'd come to expect. But there was only exhaustion and something that looked like regret. You hurt me, I said quietly. A lot. I know. And you let Mom pit us against each other. I know, she whispered again. For a long moment, we sat in silence. Finally, I nodded. Thank you for saying it. She nodded back, wiping her cheek with the heel of her hand. Afterward, I walked back to my studio, the early spring air cool on my skin. I felt lighter. Not because everything was healed, but because the burden wasn't mine to carry alone anymore. I unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet, sunlit space. My team had gone home for the evening, but the workbench lights glowed softly, illuminating rows of half-finished pieces. I walked over to the display case where the Hamilton brooch rested. Carefully, I picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in my palm. I thought about how I'd spent so many years believing that claiming what was mine required someone else to validate it. But I understood now. The brooch didn't make me worthy. Neither did my mother's approval. I'd always been worthy. I set the brooch back in its place and turned to the window. The sky was turning dusky rose over the skyline, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. 6 months later, I stood in front of the Inheritance flagship gallery, keys in hand, watching the late summer sunlight spill across the freshly painted brick facade. The letters above the door gleamed. Inheritance, jewelry, and story. It was more than a store, more than a gallery. It was a declaration. We are the authors of our own legacies. Inside, the space smelled of cedar and fresh paint. The walls were lined with glass cases, each piece lovingly displayed on linen plinths, accompanied by small placards telling its story. A locket worn through 3 generations of daughters. A cufflink that survived a fire. A brooch that once belonged to a woman named Rose. I ran my fingertips along the edge of the display housing the Hamilton collection, remembering how desperately my mother had wanted to claim it, how certain she had been that it was her due. And here it was, preserved, respected, but never surrendered. The grand opening was set for noon, but people began trickling in early: customers, reporters, a few old colleagues from my consulting days. Lydia had flown up from Charleston to see it for herself. She slipped through the door at 11:45, cheeks flushed from the walkover. You did it, she said simply, pulling me into a hug. Emily, you really did it. I smiled into her shoulder, surprised by the sudden burn of tears.
Yeah.
We did. The bell above the door jingled again, and when I looked over, my breath caught. My father stood there, hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. He was wearing the same navy blazer he'd worn to my college graduation. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then I stepped forward. Dad. Hi, Em. His voice was soft, almost tentative. I hope it's okay that I came. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'm glad you did. He looked around, taking in the displays, the polished floors, the carefully arranged lighting. It's beautiful, he murmured. Your grandmother would have been so proud. Something in my chest cracked open, and I let out a shaky breath. Thank you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I wanted to give you this. I should have done it a long time ago. I opened it carefully. Inside was a simple gold pendant, an anchor etched into its surface, the same design he'd worn on his navy ring. I had this made after you were born, he said quietly. I always meant to give it to you when you graduated. And then a life happened. I looked up, feeling the weight of everything we'd never said pressing between us. Thank you, I whispered. He nodded, his eyes bright. You've built something good here, Emily. At noon, I stepped up to the little platform we'd set near the entrance. The hum of conversation quieted, and dozens of faces turned toward me. I took a slow breath, feeling the sunlight warm my skin through the tall front windows. Thank you all for being here today, I began. When I started Inheritance, I thought I was building a business, but it's become something much bigger. I glanced around the room, letting my gaze rest for a moment on each case. These pieces aren't just objects. They're stories. They're proof that where we come from doesn't have to dictate who we become. I paused, letting the words sink in. When my grandmother entrusted me with her jewelry, she wasn't just giving me things. She was giving me a chance to decide what they would mean and what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. A hush settled over the crowd, a reverent quiet that felt like a blessing. This gallery is dedicated to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, I finished softly. To everyone who's had to reclaim what was taken from them. May you always find your way back to yourself. The applause was gentle at first, then swelling, filling the space with warmth. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the last reporter had packed up her camera, I wandered the gallery alone. I stopped at the display that housed Grandma Rose's garnet ring. The placard read, "Garnet ring, circa 1930. Belonged to Rose Carter, who believed in passing down love, not just possessions." My reflection stared back at me from the glass, older than the girl who once believed she needed someone else's permission to claim her worth. Stronger, too. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. A few weeks later, Sophie called. I nearly didn't answer. But something in me, curiosity, maybe, or the quiet hope that things could change, made me pick up.
"Hi," she said. Her voice was calm.
"I just wanted to tell you, I saw the article about the opening. It looked beautiful." "Thank you." She hesitated. "I also wanted to say that I've been trying to understand why you needed to step away." I leaned back against the window. "And I get it," she admitted. "I don't like it, but I get it." "That's something," I said softly. "Yeah." Another pause. "I'm working on some things. About myself. About how I treat people." "I'm glad," I told her. And I meant it. We didn't say more. We didn't have to. For the first time, it felt like there was space between us, a space big enough for the truth. 3 months later, I hosted the first storytelling night at the gallery. People brought their heirlooms, stood up in front of the community, and shared the stories behind them. There was an old man who told how his mother's wedding band had survived the Great Depression. A young woman who explained that her grandmother's turquoise necklace had given her the courage to leave an abusive marriage. And as I listened, I realized that all along, this was what I'd been searching for. A place where stories mattered more than appearances. A place where belonging wasn't conditional. As the evening ended, I slipped out onto the sidewalk. The summer air was soft against my skin. I thought about Grandma Rose. About my father's pendant resting against my collarbone. About Sophie, learning in her own way. I thought about the girl I'd been, small, afraid, desperate to be chosen. I wished I could tell her that someday, she wouldn't have to beg to be seen. Someday, she'd stand here, under the soft glow of the gallery lights, knowing she had chosen herself. And when I looked up at the sky, clear and bright over the city, I felt the quiet certainty that everything I'd lost had made room for something better. That sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what you're given. It's what you claim.